Okay, so hello and welcome. And today we change our plans because of situation in Palestine, and we will speak about the history of the racist state in Israel, about apartheid, about the extreme right in Israel, about Sionism. But firstly, Bruno, could you say something about the demonstration which taking place here in yesterday in Paris?
Yes, it was very important because France is the only country in the world where pro-Palestinian manifestations were forbidden. And it shows, of course, how France is linked with the imperialism and has no autonomy at all, because we can say that France is more Israeli and more American oriented now than all other Western countries, including even United States, where you had very legal and massive pro-Palestinian manifestations in New York. So France is much more systemically oriented toward imperialism than even the main stronghold of imperialism, which is United States. So it was very important that this manifestation were forbidden, and it was also very important that the organizers of this manifestation, mostly left-wing organization, trade unions, political parties, different associations, and also Muslim associations, cooperated and decided that this manifestation should be done in spite of being forbidden. And this manifestation became then automatically manifestation for Palestine, of course, but also against Macron government authoritarianism. And all the ideology which is very in the mood now in France of identity, so-called secularization, but in a bourgeois colonial way. And this, of course, this manifestation were then very important, not only for the balance of power internationally speaking, but for the balance of power inside France. And that's one point. The second point, of course, when you so when the power decide to forbid manifestations, it automatically it creates a situation when the police cannot control situation, because for normal manifestation, legal manifestation, it's obvious where the manifestation will take place, how it will be organized, who is the organizer, and how the police have to organize to control or at least observe what is happening. But when the manifestation is illegal, it creates for police states a much more difficult situation. What happened yesterday? Because, of course, the main manifestation was supposed to be carried on in Barbès, in the North Paris district, and from Barbès it had to go to Bastille, which is in the east part of Paris. And of course, the police decided to be very tough and very present at Barbès. And of course, there was a manifestation there, and they control and they repress manifestation there. But people who were going toward Barbès couldn't arrive there, and they were fighting against police north from Barbès. That's one thing. In the same time, I did with one of my comrades, which is Badia Benjeloun, you know her, Michał. We went, just two of us, because we couldn't manage to go to Barbès. So we went to the Bastille place, and there is the opera there. And we had a huge Palestinian flag and we put the Palestinian flag, and we took photos, and when we finished, we took out the Palestinian flag, and huge police cars arrived, because I think they were supposing that it means that there would be another illegal manifestation in the Bastille place. So we managed to go out. So when the huge police car arrived in Bastille place, we were leaving the place. Police didn't realize that, and they were there waiting for a manifestation which never happened there. We went to Place de la République, another place in Paris, because we were supposing that there is something there. And of course, there was a lot of mostly young people from suburbs that organized spontaneous manifestations with flags and things and things. And police there was there, but they didn't repress the manifestation, because they saw that the manifestation was very young people, very well organized, and I guess they understood that with this young tough from suburbs, they would not have the situation easily controlled. So they just, were around the place, but they didn't react. In the same time, in the north of Paris, there were riots with police, and what was very, 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 very good is the fact that young people from the same area went out to help the manifestation, but they know the district where they are living. So when the police decided to repress them, the young people from this area opened a way out. So the police couldn't even arrest massively people they wanted to, because people in the north of Paris know their place and know the way you have to manage to keep out of the area where you are supposed to be controlled under police. So it was a very good thing, because I would say that yesterday's manifestation was something like a guerrilla warfare, of course, peaceful guerrilla, but still guerrilla tactic, which showed that, first of all, people are fighting. People are conscious that the Palestinian question, the Palestinian issue, is linked with the French issue, because and that international issues are linked with local national issues, and that's very important. And it's in a certain way the government didn't manage to control the situation, and from their point of view, the idea to forbid manifestation was stupid. In fact, their situation is much worse having forbid manifestation than if they would have allowed manifestation as in other countries. So I think that at the end of the day, we can say it was a very good success, because it united young people from suburbs, mostly of Arab origin, which are not basically politicized, but they began politicized. People from left, but radical left orientation, from different belongings, and of course different ethnicity, because you had average French people with Arab people with Jewish people, because one Jewish organization took the street with Muslims and leftists. And this is also very important, because it creates, unity among masses, over ethnical and religious and ideological differences. So it's in fact we can say, thank you, Macron. You helped us quite a lot.
Bruno, there is a commentary here. I will read it. Tavish Hari. Great work, Michael and Professor Bruno. By the way, dear respected Professor Bruno, are your writings available in English? And second, wanted to know your views on Michel Parenti and Howard Zinn. So I read it, but firstly, I would like to say that in this photo which you send, and also other, I watched a little and stream from the RT. I saw that there was a flag of Algeria, Tunisia. I saw also flag the Morocco. So 3 countries. Mm-hmm. So there are the people from emigration from these countries. But why these countries? I don't know. Algeria maybe, but Tunisia and Morocco, they don't. They are not solidar with Palestinian movement.
But mostly it was Algerian, but you know, their flag for some of them, it's identity, I would say, flag is the flag that they feel connected with, because they feel that they are in France victim of racism, and you know, if you are a Moroccan, you wave the Moroccan flag. It doesn't mean you support the king of Morocco. It means that you want to treat us as Arabs. So I wave my flag, because if you are Moroccan, you will not wave the Algerian flag or the Syrian flag. You will wave the Moroccan flag. You had also Pakistani flag. So there were a group of Pakistanis, and I guess they came there for a religious reason. I suppose, because Pakistani flag. Why Pakistani flag? Because of Islam, not because of leftists. But this of course can be discussed. If it was a good idea to have national flag different from Palestine flag, but you know, it's the situation of course, that the Palestinian issues in France, for a lot of people coming from immigration, especially from Arab immigration, is also seen as an identity symbol. What is important is that on the base of this identity symbol, they mix with people manifesting for Palestine for internationalist reasons. And you know, they must change their way of thinking, because when they see people who are not Arab, who are not immigrants, manifesting with them, they understand that the Palestinian issue is not a national issue, ethnically speaking, but is an international issue. And you know, I realized it very well yesterday, because most slogans shouted by those youngs, including young waving Algerian flags, were basically, I would say, internationalist slogans, and not religious slogans or, let's say, ethnical slogans. And it's important. It's also important that you had a group of Jews manifest in this manifestation, because it automatically then it shows these manifestations are not anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. That let's say progressive Jews are fighting with Arabs. For dignity, for justice, for democracy, and eventually for socialism, and that you have Jews on your side, that Israel is not the so-called Jewish state. It's a Jewish state among Jews who are very different politically speaking, like all all people of the world. They belong to different classes, they have different opinions, and it's very important to have Jews who join this fight, even if they are not very numerous. It's not the question of how many they are, but the fact that they come is promoting a new vision of what humankind should be, and I think it's very positive in that way. And I think that yesterday's manifestation, because you had a lot of very young people, and what is very important, you had a lot of mixed, very young man and very young woman, and they were manifesting together, and that's also very important to see, because you have this préjugé in Western world that men are in the front and women don't do anything. But yesterday, Arab women were very, very tough in their behaviors, with scarves or without scarves anyway. And also this is very important, because it shows that women, at least in France, are an active part of the fight for equality, which is not only a question of national equality, but of course of all equalities, including, of course, equalities between women and men.
And your books in English?
Pardon? I have some articles in English. I have even one article about Belarus, but which was published in New York in a New York book. But basically, I have not a lot of English article, because I'm not very well known in the English speaking world. I know that there was a plan to translate my book on Solidarność in English, but unfortunately the man who had to translate it is dead. So he began the work to do it, but he didn't finish it. And of course, it would have been good if this book would have been translated in English, because I think the Solidarność issue is important for everybody, not only for Polish speaking or French speaking, but also for English speaking. But I have no contact with publishers, with English speaking publishers. If somebody happens, why not? I'm speaking English, but not very well. But I cannot do that work. Even when yes, I have some English articles in Poland. Some Polish articles were published in Poland after conferences, and they were published in English. But only article, no book. But
what
anyway,
is your review? What is your views on Michael Parenti and Howard Zinn?
Parenti, I don't really know, to be honest. No, Howard Zinn is very interesting, because, and especially in France, he's very interesting because but in Poland also, because the idea to describe the history from the point of view of popular classes. Of course, we can criticize this point or this point in his books, but the very, very basic idea to look at history bottom up and not bottom down is very important. And in this aspect, he created a trend. Because we have now a people history of France, and now there is in Poland a people's history of Poland, which was published very recently. And I think that to a certain extent, it's due to the Howard Zinn track that has been invented. And to a certain extent, even my book, when it was translated in Polish about Solidarność, my book, the title was a history from the point of view of the people. A history of Solidarność from the point of view of the people, and not from the point of view of the elite, as it was done all the time. So, to a certain extent, I think that the way Howard Zinn, of course, he didn't begin that trend, but he realized it in a much more, let's say, visible way. And it's very important, I think, to have this point of view that the history has to be seen from the side of the oppressed, from the side of the ones who had no voice, from the side of the masses, and that's my point of view.
So I will add that. My view, or Michel Parenti, is that in the 1990s he was a very good speaker when he was young. All these lectures, it's magnifique. So if you have possibility to listen Michel Parenti in YouTube, use it.
I did, but I don't know him enough to
I don't know. I am this. I said this for viewers.
Yeah.
That,
I will.
But because
anyway,
he is,
so maybe I will take time now to know him a little bit better.
No, he is good because politically he is good, but also he is good. I can say comedian. He
but
makes some tricks for that. It's easy to remember after.
Yeah,
this.
That's right.
He shout. He use Hirschmans and.
It's a way of. That's very good. No, but that's important in the ideological work. You have to do that. Just one moment. I will shut my phone, because if I don't, it will. Okay. Yes.
Okay, so now we will start speaking about the Zionism and the fascism in Israel.
Yes. So first of all, we have to, I'm historian, so maybe it's a tendency I have a bit too strong, but I always think that we have to replace things in historical context before going into the nowadays situation. And we have to take, of course, into account three things. The fact that Zionism is one of the ideology, of the nationalistic ideology, which were produced in Europe at the end of the 19th century, during colonial times, and under very strong influence of German nationalism. And that's very important. Zionism is something created in Europe for European Jews, according to the basic ideological principles of ethnicity and even racialism and even racism, which were linked with colonial ideas. That's one thing which is very important. And Zionists had nothing to do, for example, with Arab Jews. Of course, later they exploited the situation of Arab Jews up to today, but basically it's an ideology which had no contact and no roots with Arab Jews. It's purely European Jews. That's the first thing. The second thing, this ideology is the ideology created mostly for East European Jews, but supported and financed by Western Jews. But by Western, of course, Jewish bourgeoisie, because the problem of Western Jewish bourgeoisie was that they were a tiny group, because in fact, traditionally, England, France, Germany, United States were a country without Jews. Only a little group of Jews did survive in Western Europe after the Middle Ages. And of course, that were groups which were linked with bourgeois city interests. And all other Jews were either killed, either sent to Eastern Europe. And we have to remember that at the end of the 18th century, 90% of all European Jews were Polish, Lithuanian, Ruthenian, Ukrainian Jews. Almost all masses, Jewish masses, were in the state which disappeared at the end of the 18th century, which is called Poland, but in fact it was a Polish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian so-called Commonwealth. And that's very important, because why the Jewish bourgeoisie supported Zionism? Because the Rothschild family, for example, financed Zionism. But they never went to Israel when Israel was created, which is very important, because, you know, Jewish bourgeoisie as a result of the bourgeois revolutions of the 18th and 19th century in England, in the United States, in France, and so on, and even in Germany later, had a very a rather good place among bourgeoisie in Western Europe, and they were afraid by the emigration coming from Eastern Europe, and especially the immigration of Jews coming from Eastern Europe, because in Eastern Europe, as I told you, there were masses, there were Jewish masses, and Jewish masses were very radically oriented, because they were oppressed for class reason, and they were oppressed for religious reasons. So they were twice oppressed. And of course, because of these two level of oppression, they naturally were looking for an ideology which could lead to the creation of a new world. So it was natural for a Jew in Poland, in Ukraine, in Russia, when he was becoming to leave, let's say, the traditional Orthodox religious structures, naturally, in most of the case, he was looking for socialism. And Jewish immigrants arriving in France, in United States, in England, in Germany, were viewed as potential revolutionaries. And of course, the bourgeoisie didn't like that, and especially the Jewish bourgeoisie, because it was the base of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was built around different ideological argumentation, but the basic argumentation was the so-called, up to the Bolshevik Revolution, Judeo-Masonic plot, and after the Bolshevik Revolution, the so-called Judeo-Bolshevik plot. Of course, it was a myth that was created in the extreme right movements, but it managed to create the impression that all progressive, internationalist, radical socialist or communist trends are the result of a Jewish plot tending to govern the world. So if you place yourself on the side of the Jewish bourgeoisie, they had to defend, I would say, their position in the West, arguing that it's not the Jews that are creating socialism and communism. It has nothing to do with Jewishness. It is something else. But the fact was that a Jewish immigrant from Poland, let's say coming in France or in England, was potentially, of course, not every time, but potentially much more leftist than, let's say, the normal Polish or Ukrainian peasant emigrating to West, because for the reason I told you, Jews were oppressed nationally and socially, but they were also people coming from cities, from towns. Where modern ideas were circulating much easier than in the countryside. So it was much more, much easier for Jews coming from, let's say, Minsk or Vilnius or Warsaw to be socialist or communist than for a peasant from deep Galicia, for example. So when a peasant from deep Galicia come in France, he didn't know really what was socialism, what was Karl Marx, and so on. But when a Jew was coming from Łódź, for example, or Białystok in France or in England or in the United States, even if he was not a communist militant, he knew what Marx wrote. It was for him something he knew, so he could much more easily understand the world in a class context and in the situation of imperialism. And that's why the Western Jewish bourgeoisie was very often the Western, and especially the Western Jewish bourgeoisie, were very often helping Zionism, because Zionism was the occasion, first of all, to create a national Jewish feelings, replacing the internationalist one, and sending to Palestine let's say lower class Jews, instead of having to receive them in the West, where they would, push a progressive way of thinking. That's the second reason. And the third reason is also very important, because if you look at the the literature you had before the First World War, it's important that it was before the First World War. You had in England some reflection about the future world when the Ottoman Empire would disappear. It was obvious already before the First World War that the Ottoman Empire was a decaying empire which would be destroyed. And it was very important for English colonialism to replace in the Middle East the Ottoman Empire and the German imperialism, which was allied with Ottoman Empire, by, of course, the new imperialism, which was mostly the British imperialism, allied with the French one. And you have a strategical analysis in England that were made at that time, telling that the land between Mediterranean Sea and Red Sea is very, very strategical, because it will, if you control that land, you automatically destroy the potential unity of Arabs, which tend to create one nation state from Atlantic up to the Gulf. And if you control this area, automatically you geographically split the Arab world in two. And you have to look at the map of Palestine and later of Israel. because it's very important. Because if you look at from the economical point of view, there is no reason to give to Israel, to Palestine first, and to Israel, half of its territory, which is pure desert, between, let's say, South Judea, between, let's say, more or less Beersheba, Hebron, and the Red Sea, because it's pure desert. So why they give this land almost without people, and because it's desert, to Palestine and later to Israel, up to the Red Sea? It's obvious, and it appears very clearly that these borders were invented just to make the communication between, let's say, North African Arabs and Asian, let's say, or Western Asian Arabs impossible without control of the British, because Palestine became British land and later Zionist. So the Zionist plan was also very useful for the British imperialism. And it led, of course, to the Balfour Declaration. And it explains also why the Rothschild family supported that plan, because it was reinforcing their own view about the Jewish issues I told you about earlier. So because of these three reasons, the basic racist theory of colonialism in the 19th century, especially developed in Germany and then exported, I would say, in Eastern Europe, for Jews, for Poles, for Ukrainians, for Russians, for all nations or new nations developing in Eastern Europe on the base of language, ethnicity, even so-called race, and eventually, why not religion? This ideology was created for Jews under the name of Zionism. This ideology was supported by Western bourgeoisie, and especially by Western Jewish bourgeoisie, so to not have so many immigrants radically oriented in the West, who were creating among right-wing movement anti-Semitism, because they were revolutionaries, or potential revolutionaries, and because for British colonialism and later for American imperialism, the creation of the state, of a Zionist state, the state which is now called Israel, was a military base that could make impossible the, let's say, the unification of broad Arab and anti-colonial masses against, of course, colonialism and imperialism. And that's the historical background of Zionism. Zionism is a pure European colonial ideology, which was created for Jews from Eastern Europe, even if it was extended later. You had in Poland, before the Second World War, you know, Jews are very well known, or were at that time, because now it has changed a little bit, but Jews were known at that time for having a very strong sense of humor. You know, Jews, you know, because they were objectively in Eastern Europe, because they were in a tragic situation, they saw, of course, the tragedy of the world and the world system. And of course, when you look at tragedy, sense of humor is one of the things that help you to survive. People fighting for liberty, people oppressed, have always a much, much, much better sense of humor than leading group and leading classes, which are which do not know what is sense of humor. So Jews had a very, 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 very profound sense of humor in the Russian Empire, in Poland, and everywhere in Eastern Europe. And you had a joke among Jews in Poland in the pre-war period, which was that what is a Zionist? A Zionist is a Jew that is giving money to another Jew to send another Jew to Palestine. And that's very well. That's the point. That's it. And we have also, and I will finish for a historical reason on that point. We have to know that the majority of the Jews in Eastern Europe were against Zionism, because the traditional religious Jews looked up today to Zionism as a heresy that is directed against God's will. That's for the conservative part of the Jews. And that was the point of view, let's say, the traditionalist Jewish party in Poland, in pre-war Poland, which was called Agudas Israel, the traditional religious Jewish anti-Zionist party. And on the left, you had the groups, different political groups. You had, of course, the communists, but you had also the Bund, which was strongly anti-communist, which was anti-communist, by the way, but it was strongly anti-Zionist. And we have to take into account one thing, which is very important for what happened during the Second World War. In 1938, so 1 year before the war, you had in Poland local elections. And we have to take into account the fact that if on the national level, Poland at that time was a dictatorship, on local level, the Polish government, the Polish dictators didn't force anti-democratic rules. So on the local level, on the city level, you had pluralistic democracy, and because of that, the majority of cities in Poland in 1938 were not pro-government, were opposition from the left or from the right, but anyway, they were opposition. But what is very important for the Jewish issues is that in 1938 there was no communist party in Poland, because the Communist Party was dissolved, as you know, by decision of the Comintern, but it's of course another issue. So Jews of Poland had choices between traditional Jewish Orthodox religious parties, Zionist parties, and Bund, or eventually Polish PPS, Polish Socialist Party, and some Jews were promoting the PPS, the Polish Socialist Party. And the majority of Jews of Poland voted Bund. Bund in 1938 was the biggest Jewish party. And that's very important, because it shows that the majority of Jews were not Zionists. And I think it's not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons why Hitler decided later to kill all the Jews. Because he knew, as all the bourgeoisie, the German bourgeoisie knew, that Jews from Eastern Europe, it means Jews from Poland and Jews from Soviet Union, were not on the side of nationalism, of ethnical nationalism, of Zionism, because we have to remember the fact that Eichmann went in Palestine before the Second World War, and that the Zionist organization of Germany was collaborating with Nazis up to the Second World War. But when it happened before the Second World War, that the majority of the Jews of Europe do not want to be Zionists, then it showed that Jews were going rather left, rather internationalist. And then it made them enemy, of course, of the bourgeoisie and enemy of the Third Reich by the same occasion. And I think that this element is very important to take into account. And that creates the situation we know now, which is pure hypocrisy. Because the state of Israel is pretending it has been created as a reaction to the extermination of the Jews by the Nazis in the Second World War, which is pure hypocrisy, because Jews were killed mostly because they were a potentially revolutionary population, which was who was against nationalism, and especially against Jewish nationalism. So Israel is pretending to be the symbol of the Jews that were killed during the Second World War, which is a pure lie. The Jews were killed massively during the Second World War because they didn't want it to be Zionists. But of course, they have no voice because they were killed. So how can you give them voice? Of course, you have some of them, like for example, Marek Edelman, he's dead now, but who was one of the survivor of the Bund, who remembered that the Jews were anti-Zionist in their majority, and that the killed Jews were not killed because they were Jewish Zionists, but because they were Jewish anti-Zionists. And when the creation of the State of Israel was done after the Second World War, if you look at the memories of the Jewish immigrants coming to Israel from Eastern Europe after having left the concentration camp, for the survivors, of course, they were very badly treated in Israel, because in Israel they looked at them as, Jews that refuse nationalism, that refuse that didn't vote for Zionism in Europe, that didn't want to emigrate from their countries before the Second World War, and so on and so on. So Israel was basically the creation of British imperialism and of Zionist people who emigrated before the Second World War, but not of people who were the victims of the Nazi extermination during the Second World War. So that's for the historical background. Now, what is your question about nowadays situation?
No, I would like to ask about historical background, because you said a name of Karl Marx, and my question is, how is the Jews from the Western Europe? Because from Eastern Europe, it is obvious that they speak in other language. They are living together. They are not assimilated, and they were concentrated in the small areas. And if I could understand, the Jews from the Western countries, from France, England, on the Western Germany, they were assimilated, yes. And Marx, did he speak because he was a Jew?
Of course, from origin. But of course, you are right.
But he speak this Hebrew language or Yiddish?
Either Hebrew, Yiddish. He didn't know. Karl Marx was from a completely assimilated family, because already his father converted to Protestantism. So, I mean, his grandfather was a rabbi. His father was Protestant, Lutheran Protestant, and he was brought up in Lutheran religion, and later, of course, as you know, he became atheist. And he wrote a very important book about Jewish question, which would be considered today by Zionists as an anti-Semitic book if it was not written by somebody having Jewish roots. What we have to say is that, as I told you, especially maybe with one exception for Alsatian Jews, which is a specific question, but all over Western Europe, Jews were mostly belonging to bourgeois milieu. And it created, of course, people like Rothschild family, but also, for example, the British Prime Minister Disraeli, who was, of course, on the side of the British colonialism and British bourgeoisie, or Rathenau, who was in Germany, one of the leader of the German state at the moment. Germany capitulated in 1918. So Jews in the Western world, in Europe and United States, were before the First World War massively, very well integrated inside dominant society, and especially inside high bourgeoisie. And Marx, of course, comes from bourgeoisie. It's, of course, Marx was not a proletarian. It's much obvious. And Marx was completely assimilated to the German culture. And from this German bourgeois culture, he took distance and began to think the situation in a much more balanced way, with the question of class, proletariat, class struggle, and so on. But of course, at the very beginning, Marx was a man from the assimilated Jewish bourgeoisie inside the German culture. What is important still to know, and we have also to take that into account, that people from Jewish origin in Western Europe were always, I would say, slightly different from a, let's say, normal, average Western bourgeois. For historical reason, because of course their integration in the bourgeoisie was realized much later. It was realized at the end of 18th century, beginning of 19th century, when of course the Christian bourgeoisie developed from the very beginning, from the Middle Age. And that's of course important. So the family tradition of a good bourgeois from the Jewish origin carried the idea that you belong to something. You remember that you belong to something which was minority. That's first thing. The second thing is that Jewish religion, like Muslim religion, and it's basically very different with Catholicism, was based on, and is based on, the fact that you must read the Holy Book. A good Jew must know Hebrew. Not the Hebrew of the Israel state nowadays, the traditional, the old Hebrew, which is a dead language for religious reason, just like a Muslim must read Quran in Arabic. And because of that, and that's very important, if you must read the Holy Book, it means you must read. You must know how to read. And of course, from the very beginning of the history of Europe, Jews were people who were able to read at least the Holy Book. But if you will read the Holy Book, you read. And even if you are just religious oriented, still you are to a certain extent educated to think about what is written. Even if you just say, I just want to read the Holy Book and nothing else, still, if you read the Bible, it makes you think because you read, then you must think what you are reading. Even if you don't want to think, you must think. And that of course is very important, and that explains, of course, in Europe why the Jews were in the vanguard of capitalism, just like the Protestants were, because the Protestant under Luther and Calvin went back to this tradition that a good Christian must read Bible. So that's not, and of course you cannot imagine a bourgeois revolution without the capability of reading. And that's why the bourgeois revolution were to a large extent made by elite, but by bourgeois elite who were able to read. Bourgeois Christian Protestant elite, bourgeois Jewish elite, and of course, to a certain extent later, bourgeois Catholic elite who understood that they should read. And it's very important because even if you become an atheist from a Jewish background, you have this tradition in your family that to read is what makes the difference between a real human being and something like a passive animal. That's the basic difference. And of course, even if you're not believing in God, even if you change religion or have no religion, the family tradition, you have to read, creates among people from Jewish origin, like among people from Muslim origin, like among people from Protestant origin, that it's much more important to read, and not only Bible. Then if you begin to read and you are quite curious about the world, the Bible opens you to other readings, because you read the Bible and then you reflect, what is written in the Bible? I would like to see a history book about, let's say, old Israel. And a history book is a scientific book. And then if you begin with scientific book on history, you go to scientific book in philosophy. And if you go in scientific book on philosophy, then you begin to read mathematical book or biological book or astronomical book or whatever you want. And you open your mind. And that's for sure. That people from Jewish origin were much more average, on the average, had a much higher level, intellectual level than average European. I mean, even in Poland, which was a backward country in the 19th century, so a very, when I say backward, of course, it means economically background, not a lot of industry, no very big towns, not an education system, and so on. But still, in this, let's say, tragical situation of a backward Poland, every Pole, every inhabitant of Poland, being pro-Jews or anti-Semitic, it doesn't change, looked at the Jews as people which we in Poland call Żydowski łeb. It means what? It means the Jewish head. And what it means that, a Polish peasant, when he was in a complicated situation, he didn't understood what was going on, let's say, very average things like I have to pay tax and I don't know how to manage with that, and I don't understand that, or they took my son in the army and I don't know how to react to that, everyday life problems. He went to the Jews of the village or the little town. He knew, because he had contact with some Jews because of trade and things like that. And he went to the Jews and he asked the Jews, I have this problem. Could you explain me what's happening? What is this problem? How I have to deal with it? And it's very important, because the Polish peasant preferred to go to the Jews than to the priest for such questions. Because the priest, yes, he knew how to read, but he was from the, higher class. The little Jewish shopkeeper, to a certain extent, he was on the class level nearer to the peasant. So, I mean, the Polish peasant had much more confidence to the Jewish neighbor than to the priest on that level. Of course, religiously speaking, he was a Catholic, but it was better to go to Żydowski web, as I told you. He had the Jews was clever. The priest, he was intriguing in the interest of the nobility, of the elite. No confidence for average question. It doesn't mean that there was no anti-Semitism in Poland. Of course there was, but it was not the anti-Semitism you have in Germany. Because in Germany, the anti-Semitism was purely intellectual. It means that most Germans didn't see any Jews for whole their life. I mean, in Germany, in 1939, you had only 500,000 Jews for a country which had 70 million people. So it means that 80% of Germans never speak to any Jews for their whole life. So their anti-Semitism was a pure idea because they had no contact with Jews. And even if they had contact with Jews, they had contact with assimilated Jews that were looking like normal Germans. But in Eastern Europe, there was no place in Eastern Europe, in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania, there was no place where you had no Jewish neighbors. So you had always Jews among your direct relations, and of course, and that's why the Catholic Church was so anti-Semitic. It was not only because traditionally church is anti-Judaistic for a religious reason, but it was also because Jews were carrying in the countryside ideologies coming from the cities, and especially progressive, liberal, or even, of course, socialist and communist ideas. So the priests were very conscious that one Jewish neighbor can do a lot of bad things for the interest of the traditional society. Because when the peasant was going to the Jew, asking him, please help me to answer to the administration because I have this problem and I don't know how to read and write, and I don't understand all that stuff because it's for me completely ununderstandable. Of course, the Jew was helping him, but in the same time, he could explain to the peasants some basic situation about the social situation, about the political situations, about the economical situation, about the government, why the government is demanding taxes on peasants, and so on and so on. And in a certain sense, he was spreading bad ideas to the whole Polish society, Polish or Ukrainian or Belarusian society, and that's why also the Zionists were afraid, because Zionist in Eastern Europe was not an ideology of the people. It was an ideology for the lower Jewish classes. It was the ideology of the let's say middle bourgeoisie, Jewish middle bourgeoisie in Poland was in favor of Zionism, was financing Zionism. And that's why, of course, Zionist parties were much richer than the Bund, for example, or the left parties, because they had money. They had money because they had the support of the bourgeoisie, the local bourgeoisie and the Western bourgeoisie. But in spite of that, as I told you, Zionists were in minority. As showed the 1938 election, and that's very important. Zionist is an ideology of the Jewish minority, supported by the Jewish bourgeoisie and sometimes by Christian bourgeoisie and even by pro-Nazi Germany, because as I told you, from 1933 to 1939, Zionists were in favor of Nazism in Germany, but not only in Germany. In United States, the Zionist organization financed by the Third Reich, financed a campaign against the boycott of Third Reich products in the United States, and they fought against, of course, left-wing American organizations appealing to boycott the Third Reich, but they fought against the Jewish leftist organization in the United States, were of course supporting the boycott of the Third Reich. And for example, the head of the Hamburg America Linie, which was financing this campaign against boycott, and the Hamburg America Linie, it was the naval company, the German naval company linking United States with Germany. The head of the Hamburg America Linie in New York, named by the Nazi Party, was a Zionist, Jewish Zionist. Named by the Nazi Party. That's, of course, some aspect of the history Israel doesn't want to talk about.
There is a question from the chat. Deranian asks, hello, what was the role of the USSR in the beginning of the Israel state?
That's an important issue, because you know, from the very beginning, of course, of the Bolshevik movement to 1946, let's say, communists were radically anti-Zionist, and there is no doubt about that. In 1945, 1946, USSR officially changed partly its way of looking at this issue. It has, of course, to be analyzed in a more scientific way than it was done, because we don't really know up till now who decided that in Soviet Union, and which and if it represented all the Soviet Union or Soviet Party or fraction of the Soviet Party. But it's another question. But from 1945-46 up to 1949, it's sure that USSR and its ally supported Zionists financially, militarily, and I say allies because Polish army, for example, in 1946 and 1947, created a training camp in Bolków, in Lower Silesia, for the Haganah, which was the Zionist army. Czechoslovakia sent arms to the Zionists. So it was not only the Soviet Union, it was also People's Poland and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia at the time, which were supported Zionists. Of course, it was, according to me, but of course it has to be better analyzed than I do now. According to me, it was a pure tactical decision, because at that time, Zionist movement tended to be more and more anti-British, because if as I told you, the Zionist program was supported by British after the First World War and in the interwar period, at a second moment, the Britons began to fear that the Zionists are, let's say, creating among Arabs such tensions against them that their allies in the Arab world, I mean the conservative monarchies in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, and so on, are weakened among their own people. And that Britain must help to a certain extent these monarchies to preserve their legitimacy, pretending that they are fighting in the interest of the Arabs. So Britain changed a little bit its behavior towards Zionists, and then from the Soviet point of view, you had the choice between supporting Zionists who were to a certain extent, or at least in a visible way, fighting British imperialism, and Arab states who were at that time, except for Syria, all very pro-colonial, pro-British, conservative, pro-imperialistic monarchies. So looking at that from the Moscow perspective, you could have the impression that if there is a Jewish state in Palestine, this state will be much more progressive and much more left and much more Soviet-oriented than the King of Jordan, of Egypt, or of Saudi Arabia, or for Iraq, because Iraq also was a pro-British monarchy at that time. And that's for sure, at that time, Soviet Union did help the creation of the State of Israel. The situation, of course, changed radically very quickly after the creation of the State of Israel, because when the State of Israel was created, Ben-Gurion, who was the prime minister of the new state, declared that we thank Soviet Union for helping us, but basically we are on the side of America, of United States, and of Western democracies. So it looked that, of course, this state was not decided to join the anti-imperialist camp, but to go on the imperialist side. That's one, let's say, we're on the world level. And on the more local level, from the Soviet point of view, one of the Israeli minister came to Soviet Union, Golda Meir, who will be later the prime minister of Israel, but at that time she was only minister, and she arrived in Moscow, and you had a huge, let's say, meeting committee, unofficial meeting committee of a lot of Jewish Soviet leaders. And it happened then to the Soviet leadership that the Zionists have some influence among, let's say, not Jews of Soviet Union, but among Jewish elite of Soviet Union, Jewish intellectuals, and so on, and that Israel will try to use that to have influence within the Soviet society, and this convinced a lot of Soviet leaders, including Stalin, that Israel will not be the tool of anti-imperialism in the Middle East, but would be the tool of imperialism in Soviet Union, among the Jewish population of Soviet Union, who was very important, because you had more or less 3 million of Soviet citizens belonging to the Jewish nationality. Since Soviet Union is, of course, a multinational state. So this led to the break of relations between Israel and not complete, because the Soviet Union had diplomatic relation with Israel up to 1967, up to the 1967 war. But we can say that from 1949 up to 1967, the relation between Soviet Union and Israel were cold. But of course, you had this moment when the Soviet Union made the wrong decision. And when I say the wrong decision, I just tell that because Soviet Union changed his mind after having taken this decision. So it means it's changed its mind because this decision happened to be not in the interest of Soviet Union, not in the interest of progressive humankind, not in the interest of progressive left orientation. So that's right, and we have to take this into account. And it shows that this Soviet Union is not a straightforward line. The decision has changed around the time, and we have, of course, to analyze what balance of power we had in Soviet Union, which led to this decision. If we have a non-monolithical and non-totalitarian analysis of Soviet Union, then we have to have a much more pluralistic analysis of Soviet Union. Soviet Union was not a monolithic state, and up to today, I'm not able to tell you who from the Soviet leadership was in favor of this, let's say, pro-Zionist orientation after the Second World War, and who was opposed to it, because, of course, these two trends existed. So, because we see them before 1949 and after 1949.
Okay, so now I would like to ask you about the state Israel after creation. And one of the arguments of the liberals from the Western countries, why they support Israel, they said, we support Israel because it is the democracy. It is democracy, they are modern, they are progress. So could you say something about this state, this creation? Because I think that it is apartheid, it is not liberal democracy.
It is a democracy, but it is an apartheid democracy, as you had in apartheid South Africa. In South Africa, at the time of apartheid, you had, of course, a democracy, but a democracy reserved for the whites. And Israel is also that type of democracy, even if some Arab have the voting rights. The majority of them have not, and we have to begin with the beginning. It means when the Israeli state was created, about 700 up to 800,000 Arab Palestinians were expelled from Israel. So these people never received the voting right, because they never received the right to come back to their home. So it's a state which from the very beginning is realizing what we call the ethnical cleansing. So what democracy can be based on ethnical cleansing? The same thing was done by apartheid in South Africa. They declared from a certain moment that all the blacks in South Africa have what they call the Bantustans. It means they have reservations, which will be so-called independent states. They will have democracy in these pseudo states, but they cannot, even if they live in South Africa, even if they work in South Africa, even if their ancestors were living in South Africa, they are not South Africans and they have no civic rights in South Africa. That's exactly the same thing Israel did in 1948. They decided that the majority of Palestinian or Arab have to leave Palestine, that if they want democracy, they have to have democracy outside their own country. But they cannot come back to their country and participate to the democracy which was called Israel. That's the first thing. The second thing is that after the 1967 war, Israel conquered the rest of Palestine. It means what we call now the West Bank and Gaza. And it was a, let's say, normal occupation situation up to the beginning of the 20th century. The 21st century, excuse me. And at that time, the Israeli allowed elections in those territories, not of course taking into account the Palestinians which were expelled out of Palestine because they have no voting rights. They have no voting rights in Israel, and they have of course also no voting right in the West Bank and Gaza. But at least, let's say, the Israeli allowed part election to the population of West Bank and Gaza. But the Palestinians didn't vote the right way, so-called right way. They voted for Hamas. They didn't vote for the Palestinian, for Mahmoud Abbas and, let's say, the wing of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which decided that they will collaborate with Israel. Some of the member of the PLO, of the Palestine Liberation Organization, especially the People's Front of Liberation of Palestine, didn't accept the Oslo agreement. But because of this situation and for a lot of other reasons, Hamas appeared to be, and it's another question, what is Hamas? And of course, I cannot talk about that for the moment because it would be another topic. But anyway, Hamas happened to appear for Palestinians as the main Palestinian still resisting movement to the Israeli occupation, and the majority of the Palestinians decided then, whatever they think about Islamism, they decided to vote for Hamas. And the majority of the West Bank and Gaza voted for Hamas. And as soon as these elections were done, part of the MPs were all arrested by the Israeli army, and the parliament could never sit. And there is no, since that time, there is no pluralistic democracy in the West Bank and Gaza. So how can you say that the Israel is a democracy, is the only democracy, since Israel destroyed the second democracy, according, of course, to bourgeois right, the second democracy of Middle East? They didn't realize democracy, non-racial democracy, inside the 1948 borders, and they destroyed the democracy they created outside the 1948 borders. So if there is not a second democracy, according to the Israeli discourse in the Middle East, it's only due to Israel. Because a normal democracy should have accepted the MPs who were elected during that election. It means, of course, a government created by the Hamas, But as you know, the basic rule of democracy is that you have to take the result as they are and not as you want they would be. And that, secondly, in the UN Charter, it's written that every colonized nation has the right to stand up, and we have not the right to decide which way a dominated population consider how to liberate itself. So if they choose the legal struggle or the military struggle, it's their things. It's not. It has not to be decided by foreign powers. And if they decided to have a right-wing, left-wing, religious or anti-religious government, it's their things. It's not the things of the dominating power. So anyway, whatever we look at the Hamas won the election. And since it won the election, it was the road to the creation of the second democracy in the Middle East. Second bourgeois democracy, because I don't talk about other countries like Syria who talk that they are democratic, but on other bases. I'm just talking about bourgeois democracy. So if you are logical with the ideology of the bourgeois democracy, Israel is not a democracy because it's an ethnocracy. And occupied Palestine is not a democracy due to Israel and not to the Palestinians. So that's the answer to your question.
Okay, so now I would like, what is your answer for all these things which are in the liberal media, which accuse the left in the Europe, that left in Europe now, which is make the demonstration solidarity with the Palestine, that it is anti-Semitism, because in Europe it is also anti-Semitism, and now they changed the anti-Sionism. It is something like the anti-Semitism for the leftists.
Yes, of course, we can say that anti-Semitism existed in Europe. That's obvious. And to a certain extent, it still exists, even if I think that the nowadays anti-Semitism is not exactly the same as the the post, let's say, rather, Third Reich anti-Semitism, but that's another question. It doesn't change the basic fact that you have in Europe, especially, or in the United States, in the Western world, anyway, you have this tradition of anti-Semitism, which was developed in the 19th and 20th century, which is something different from the old anti-Judaism based on religious reason, even if there are some links with that. But anyway, of course, that anti-Semitism exists, not exactly the same and not so strong as it was before the end of the Third Reich, but still it exists, and there is no discussion about it. Of course, you find people with anti-Semitic ideologies in the Western world, and that's obvious. These people, and that's also right, some of these people, knowing that their anti-Semitism has been, let's say, has been delegitimized by the Third Reich and the defeat of the Third Reich, pretend now that they are not anti-Semitic, even if they are, but they pretend, of course, that they are not anti-Semitic because they know that contrary to the 30s, if they arrive openly with anti-Semitism, they would not have the support they had in the 30s because of course, the historical evolution. And that's right. So there you will find anti-Semites which pretend, they are not anti-Semitic, that they are anti-Zionist. That's right. For example, in France, you have one man who is quite known, Alain Soral. If you read his books, his articles, it happens very clearly that under the supposed anti-Zionist discourse, you find most, not all, but most of the traditional anti-Semitic argumentation of the pre-war or war, of course, anti-Semitic tradition. That's for sure. And I talk about him, but you can find the same things in different French circles, German circles, English circles, Belgian circles, American circles, and Latin American circles. I don't talk here about the situation in the Muslim world, because it's something completely different, and the relation between Muslims and Jews are completely different. I mean, we can talk, of course, about them, but they are based on completely different tradition and completely different bases. And I think that we cannot talk about Muslim anti-Semitism. There is an anti-Judaism among Muslims. There is sometimes importation of Western anti-Semitism inside the Muslim world, but it's a colonial process. It's a colonization of the elite, as you have liberal trends coming from Western society in Muslim world, as you have Marxist trend coming in Muslim world from Western world, but that's something completely different. So I'm talking about anti-Semitism in Europe. So it exists, and that's for sure, and it's in the right wing. But we have to know, and if you look, for example, at the Communist Manifesto of Karl Marx, when he is talking about the so-called German socialism or the true socialism, he's describing a form of, quote, socialism that can be called reactionary socialism, that can be described as regressive socialism, or even, if you use modern words, as a right-wing socialism. And of course it exists. And we have to take that into account, that sometimes, especially in the periods where the line dividing what is called progressive and what is called conservative, what is called leftist and what is called rightist, are unclear. And that's the situation we have now. For a lot of reasons, the borderline between right-wing ideologies and left ideologies sometimes, not everywhere, of course, but sometimes become unclear. So, of course, in this confusion, you can have people having, let's say, right-wing opinions that, mix with something that looks more or less left. And that's, for example, the case of Alain Soral. Alain Soral was considered earlier, it's less clear, of course, now, but in the 70s, 80s, he was even invited at meetings of the Communist Party. Because it was the Communist Party at that time in France was becoming ideologically unclear. And of course, since the Communist Party was unclear, they looked at the unclearness of Alain Soral as something potentially leftist, which was, of course, not the case. But at that time, it could appear like that. And that's why you can have inside left-wing movements some people, some trends, which are not very clear about the very strict border that has to be drawn between Zionism and Jewishness, and consequently between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And of course, what I'm talking about is also, of course, it's in the interest of the right wings and the extreme right wing movement to be unclear about that. But it's also in the interest of the state of Israel to be unclear about that. Because since the state of Israel is basically fought by left-wing movements, basically, if you look in the world, it's obvious. It is much more efficient to show this anti-Zionist movement as being anti-Semitic, because, of course, every left-wing militant is carrying in himself the anti-fascist tradition. And when you tell him, "Oh, look, you are going anti-Semitic," it creates, strong tension among leftist people. It divides them, it hurts them, and it makes them lose a lot of time in inefficient discussion to show that they are not anti-Semitic, they are just anti-Zionist, and so on and so on. But the time they concentrate on that question, let's say, for example, Jeremy Corbyn in Great Britain, for example, is a very good example. Jeremy Corbyn had chances to become the British Prime Minister because the Labour Party was developing. I'm not talking about if Jeremy Corbyn was the good candidate or not the good candidate, but anyway, he was a leading force in the British society at a certain moment. He made quite a lot of error on different issues, especially, for example, the Brexit issues, but that's another point. But anyway, he had to lose a lot of time in his campaign to demonstrate what is obvious, that he's not anti-Semite. He's not anti-Semite. Whatever you can think about Jeremy Corbyn, he's not. It's obvious he's not an anti-Semite. But the time he had to talk about that, he couldn't talk about class situation, about social issues, about capitalism, about class struggle, and so on and so on. And finally, he was expelled from the political life in Britain. And it's a very good example of how you use the tool of pretend anti-Semitism against popular movement, against progressive movement, and in favor also of imperialism, and especially the Israeli aspect of the world imperialism. And that's, of course, basically important. But it is very clear, if you look at things very openly, that Zionism is not Jewishness, and that anti-Semitism then is not anti-Zionism. And that's obvious because all the left tradition from the very beginning is anti-Zionist. So if you consider that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, for example, it means that Karl Marx was anti-Semite, Lenin was anti-Semite, Stalin was anti-Semite, even Drweski was anti-Semite, and Bund was anti-Semite. Because if you look, for example, at the articles published in the pre-war period by the Bund leaders about Zionism, they enter exactly in the discourse you find in Israel about the so-called anti-Semitism of the left. So what we have to do in the progressive camp is just to take the quotations from Bund leaders and communist leaders of the pre-war period about anti-Zionism and then ask Zionists, do you think these people were anti-Semite? And of course they were not. They were Jews. And Bund was even fighting for Jewish culture. But the real Jewish culture, the Yiddish culture, because the real Jewish language in Europe, I'm talking of course about European Jews, is the Yiddish language, not the Hebrew. Because the Hebrew language we have now, first of all, it's not the bad biblical Hebrew, because the biblical Hebrew is a dead language from the antiquity. But the actual Hebrew language is a pure artificial creation. You don't know, I mean, not a lot of people know about that, but linguists do know about that the majority of words of the the new Hebrew language are not coming from the biblical Hebrew, because there were no words for a lot of things existing nowadays. The majority of words in the actual Hebrew language are coming from German, from English, from Polish, from Russian, and from Arab. That's the basic vocabulary of the new Hebrew language, and the grammatical structure of the new Hebrew language is partly Polish. The order of words and so on are coming from Polish. Why? Because the Zionists in the interwar period were mostly coming from Poland. And since the Zionists hated, and it has to be very well repeated, the Zionists hated the Yiddish language, because for them the Yiddish language was the language of the Jewish submitted to the Christian world. So they hated the Jewish and they wanted to destroy Yiddish, and they destroyed Yiddish. So they preferred to talk in Polish and not in Yiddish, because their hate of the Yiddish and of the Jewish traditional culture was so strong that they preferred the Polish one than the Jewish one. So the Jews, the Zionists, were much more assimilated to the Polish cultures than let's say the Bund, for example, in a term of linguistic language. But since the Jewish leaders were talking in Polish, because they were not talking in Hebrew, because you couldn't have a conversation in modern Hebrew in Warsaw in 1932, because nobody would have understood you, because this language was not existing at that time. So you had to choose when you talk to Jews in 1932 in Warsaw, if you will talk to them in Polish or in Yiddish. And they preferred to talk in Polish and not in Yiddish, because they hated the Yiddish. So they were also, of course, Polish-speaking people emigrating to Palestine and later Israel with a Polish language structure in their mind. So they created a Hebrew language with mixed words coming, as I told you, from Slavic language mixed with Arabic languages, and eventually English words, in a Polish grammatical structure. So the new Hebrew language is a pidgin of Slavic language, Arabic language, and Old Hebrew language, and it has nothing to do with the Jewish culture. It's a new culture which is completely artificial, which has nothing to do with the Jewish traditional culture, which has nothing to do. And I would say that the state of Israel, in its conception, if you look really how functions the Israeli institutions, they are much nearer to Polish pre-war institutions than Polish institution now. Because, you know, the Israeli institutions were created by people who partly were elected in the pre-war Polish parliament. So their political culture is the pre-war Polish culture, and they imported it in Palestine and created it in Israel. At the time, Poland was going socialist. So the actual Polish culture, even if it doesn't please to Kaczynski and all the political elite today, they are still post-socialist, because they behave in an anti-communist way, but with a communist background. But the Israeli behave in a pre-war Polish way, without the socialist and communist background, because of course in Palestine you had no socialist era. And that's very interesting, in political science and sociology, because to a certain extent the state of Israel is an old Poland, to a certain extent, of course, and the actual Kaczynski's Poland, supposedly old traditional Poland, is still a post-socialist Poland. But they don't know about it. But we have to tell them that their way of thinking is a degeneration of socialism, but still post-socialism in Poland. And that Israel is rather a post-Piłsudski state that the Israeli state wouldn't accept, as Kaczynski wouldn't accept. The ideal would be to change them, to send Kaczynski to Israel and Israeli leader to Poland. If you want to have a real Piłsudski Poland, Netanyahu is much nearer to Piłsudski Poland than Kaczynski. I don't like Netanyahu, so I don't want to have him back to Poland, but still.
I didn't hear about this. It was very interesting.
I know, but
I always thought that Israel, it is copy of the British colonial state, like the Australia, USA, Canada.
You are partly right. On one way, it is that the law of Israel are partly coming from the British law that was introduced during the British colonial times. And you're right on that point. You are right, but I'm not talking about the legal aspect. I'm talking about the political culture. If you look how the Knesset, the Israeli parliament functions, and if you look how the Polish Sejm was functioning in, let's say, 1925, then you see it's exactly the same. I mean, the average culture of an Israeli MP is the average culture of a Polish MP of the pre-war period, or a political leader, or the political argumentation. For example, I would give you an example coming back to the Palestinian issue. During the pre-war period, the Polish nationalists, the so-called NDEC, developed the argumentation that since we are in a democratic bourgeois state, of course, national minorities have the right to have their MPs in the parliament. But for a strategically important question for the Polish state is the Polish state of the Polish nation, and national minority MPs should not have the right to vote for a strategical question. They can vote for questions, let's say, linked with taxes, but they cannot vote for a military question, diplomatic question, and so on, because they are national minority, and the Polish state is basically for the Polish ethnical nation. And that was their argument, that the Ukrainian and Jewish MPs should leave the parliament at the moment where questions of national importance are discussed. That was the ideology of the Endecja, of the far-right Polish right. But you have exactly the same ideology within the Israeli Knesset. I would say the Israeli Index, it means the Israeli right, is now pretending that the Arab minority has the right to have MP. But on national question, they should not vote, because Israel is the nation is the state of the Jewish nation. It's not the state of its citizen, it's the state of the Jewish nation. So for a strategical national reason, the minority cannot vote. This argument is unacceptable to any liberal Western bourgeois. You cannot imagine that in the French parliament or in the British parliament or in the United States parliament, you would have an MP that would arrive at the discourse, doing his discourse, telling that this MP is from Jewish or from Arabic origin, he cannot vote on a national issue. It's impossible to imagine that within the bourgeois democracy, such an argumentation. But it's an argumentation you find in the Knesset. And it's the exact argumentation you had in the Polish pre-war parliament. Exactly word to word the same argumentation, that it changed, that at that time it was Jews and Ukrainian, and now it's Arab.
But in Knesset there are the Palestinians?
There are Palestinians.
And
but
how many?
The nationalist Zionists think they have the right to vote for, let's say, issues like the building of a road or of a railway. But they have no right to vote on diplomatic question, military question, and state security questions.
Okay, so the title of our conversation is Sionism and Fascism in Israel. And I would like to speak about fascism in Israel, because if I good understand, we can find two kinds of fascism. One kind, it is the state of Israel. And yesterday I spoke with the Palestinian who lived in Poland, Nidal Hamad, and he said a word that it was the Israel left which was killed more Palestinian than Israeli right. Mm-hmm. And it was possible because it is not important it is left or right are ruling in Israel, because the state is the fascist. But I want to ask you about the extreme right in Israel. So the fascist in this fascist state, because today this problem which is now in Palestine, it is because the Netanyahu, who is extreme right, he is in coalition in the people who are more extreme right than Netanyahu.
Yeah, so of course you are right. And you are right. And also, first of all, we have to understand that left in Israel, there are two left in Israel. There is the Zionist left, and there is the non-ethnical left. The non-ethnical left was traditionally concentrated in Israel in the Communist Party of Israel. But now it is part of what we call the Arab coalition. And you have people with anti-Zionist Zionist feeling in Israel, Jews, like, for example, Shlomo Sand, who is a Jew. And he asked Israeli Jewish voters to vote for the Arab list, because the so-called Arab list have some Jews which are anti-Zionist oriented. So when we talk about the left in Israel, we have to make the difference between the pro-Zionist left, which is ethnocratic. That's fine. And he was right, the guy you talked with on that point. And the internationalist left, which is also Jewish, but mostly now linked with the Arab minority. Not only, but that was the same situation in Poland in the pre-war period. In the pre-war period, the most progressive Poles, and especially the communists, were really linked with national minorities. In the Communist Party of Poland, about 40% of the members were from Jewish origins, and the Jews in Poland were only 10%, but in the Communist Party they were 40%. So the national minority, in this case the national Arab minority in Israel, is the forefront of the progressive trend in Israel. Of course, it includes some Jews, but Jews accepting the idea that their state should be a citizen state and not an ethnocratic state. And that's right. Of course, that the left in Israel, the Zionist left, created a state which defines who is a Jew on the religious background. And that's the paradoxical situation, that the so-called secularized state of Israel, created by left-wing so-called Zionists, had to base its citizenship law on religious basis. And for example, during the left Zionist but Jewish rule in Israel, you had the law according to which it is impossible to marry somebody in Israel without having religious weddings. So Jews have to marry with Jews, Muslim with Muslims, Christian with Christians. And when a Jew wanted to marry a Muslim girl or a Christian girl, he had to went to Cyprus, which is not very far from Israel, marry in Cyprus and come back then to Israel with a Cyprus wedding, a non-religious paper. So in this sense, that's right, that the left Zionists are right-wing, philosophically speaking. They are right-wing. They are maybe on the left side of the Zionism, but Zionism as a base is an ethnocratic ideology, which it's not internationalistic. You have to know that, for example, the Workers' Party, the Labour Party, trade unions in Israel refused to have non-Jewish members up to the 50s. Non-Jewish member couldn't belong to the Labour Party trade unions, the Histadrut. And you had, in the pre-war period in Palestine, strike organized by the Labour Party trade unions against Jewish employers who employed Arabs. And they were striking, asking the Jewish employers to kick out Arab workers from their factory and reserve the work for Jews. So, you know, that's the Jewish left, the Jewish Zionist left in Israel. But on the basis of that ideology, of course, you had a more right-wing way ideology, which is more coherent. It is the Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was the leader of the party Netanyahu is member of. And Jabotinsky never denied the basic fact that his political, let's say, leader, the ideal leader was Mussolini. Jabotinsky was in favor of Mussolini. He was talking that Mussolini is the good ideology for the Jews. But we have also to remember that Mussolini was not basically anti-Semitic. The difference with Hitler. Of course, he began after because of his alliance with Hitler, but it was rather an opportunistic evolution of Mussolini. Basically, Mussolini was let's say, an ethnical nationalist, not a racialist nationalist. So for Jabotinsky, Mussolini could be the ideal man for Italy and the model for the future Israel. What has changed now is that in Israel is that the fact that the Jewish extreme right in Israel was rather secularized, as is Netanyahu and Netanyahu party, the Likud. But during the process of development of Israel, appeared a more and more stronger religious far right, which was very, very little at the very beginning. As I told you at the very beginning, the big majority of the rabbis in the world were against Zionism. With the creation of the state of Israel, within the Jewish religion, appeared a Zionist trend. This Zionist trend was at the beginning in minority within the religious Jews. After it began step by step the majority. And at the very end, they created extreme right religious group, which are now, of course, very strong in Israel. So now you have two extreme right in Israel. You have the secularized extreme right, which is a purely, let's say, racist, nationalistic, fascist-oriented extreme right on racial ground. And you have also more or less cooperating with them, but on different ideological ground. You have the religious extreme right, which is of course based on the interpretation of the Bible in a nationalistic, ethnic, racist way. So you have two extreme rights in Israel. Both of them are violent, fascist, racist, and so on. But one is based rather on a secularized, biological, racist base, and the other one is rather religiously oriented. You have to know something which is also important. In Israel, you have two interesting things in universities. You have no history department in Israeli university. You have always Jewish history department and international history department, and they are not mixed. Of course, general history department are more or less progressive, and Jewish history department are always very right-wing oriented. But you have another thing. In biology department, you have a department of Jewish blood, which are working, quote, to the discovery of what differentiates the Jewish blood from the other bloods. Of course, it's pure ideology. It has nothing scientific to do with, but it's purely Nazistic. But because the Nazi had exactly the same argumentation that the Jewish blood is different from the Aryan blood, but the extreme Zionist, racist, secularized one pretend that the Jewish blood is not the same as the Aryan blood. And they work on that, and they try to discover the specificity of the Jewish blood. But of course, you will not find that in the Jewish Jewish university, yes, but the biological department. But you will not find that in the Israeli propaganda, because of course they are sufficiently intelligent to understand that if the world would know that there are faculty in Israel working on so-called Jewish blood, everybody understands it's Nazi way of thinking. I think
how it is
every
happened
race
that
is equal, and the same theory you can find in every part of the world. So you can have Jewish Nazi, as you had German Nazi, as you have Polish Nazi, as you have Russian Nazi or French Nazi. Nazism is an ideology that can fit to every racial group. If you believe that there is such thing as racial group, which of course is a pure nonsense.
In the finish, I would like to ask you how it is happened that in Europe nobody speak about these things which you said now about these racial things about
If
this
I
Nazis.
would be anti-Semitic, but take that as a joke, of course. If I would be an anti-Semite, I would answer you that is because the Jewish are controlling the world, and of course they are controlling medias. Of course, that's a joke, but you have to know, of course, that the interest of the state of Israel are linked with the interest of the imperialism. I mean, Israel would disappear in 5 seconds if it was not linked with imperialism, world imperialism, and especially with American imperialism. And as you know, imperialism has the force to control most medias which are private, or even when they are state-owned, states are linked with imperialistic interests. So it's not in the interest of the imperialists, whatever they are, American, French, Jewish, British, German, Australian, or whatever you want. It's not in their interest to delegitimize the advanced base, the forefront base of the imperialism in the Middle East. Because, as I told you, this base cuts the communication road between Africa and Asia. And it cuts automatically the possibility of integration, social, cultural, economical integration of the African Asian world, which we called earlier the third world, or the anti-imperialist world, or the anti-colonial world. And that's the basic reason was the state of Israel was created, to cut these lines. That's why the Soviet Union didn't understand in the 40s what I talked about earlier, but that's another thing. But of course, basically, the state of Israel is the most advanced military base of world and especially US imperialism in the geostrategical region, which has to be divided in more and more political entities. Colonial powers did divide it in different countries like Syria, Jordan, and other artificial states like United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and whatever you want. But it's not sufficient. If you look at the Israeli policy now in Syria, they planned, for example, the division of Syria in 4 states, the division of Iraq in 3 states, etc. And eventually, if Saudi Arabia don't go on their way, they know that Saudi Arabia can be cut in 5 states. And so on and so on. And you have also the American, not Israeli in this case, but the American intervention in Iran to create, for example, an independent Baluchistan or an independent Kurdistan or an independent Azerbaijan, and so on and so on. And so the strategy of the imperialism is divide and rule. And the state of Israel was placed there to promote that strategy. So that's the reason why. It's not because of Jewish plot controlling the world, as the anti-Semite pretend. But of course, if you are not very well educated, and even if you have left-wing orientation, you can quite easily believe, the Jews are controlling the medias. But it's not the Jews, it's the imperialists. The imperialists can be Jews, but they can be Christians, they can be atheists. Most of the neoconservatives in the United States are pure atheists. They come from Trotsky's background, but they are fanatically pro-Israel. But there are people like Newland, like Samantha Power, like Blinken, like a lot of them. They are fanatically pro-Israel, but they are not pro-Israel because they are Jews. Some of them are Jews, some of them are not. But they are fanatically pro-Israel because Israel is the advanced base of the imperialism in the African Asian region. That's the basic reason why they are supporting Colombia in Latin America, for the same reason, because Colombia is not a Jewish state, it's not an ethnical state, but Colombia is the advanced base of imperialism against Venezuela, against Ecuador, against Brazil, against Peru, and it's the basic stronghold of imperialism in that region. So Colombia in Latin America, Israel in the Middle East, Japan in far Eastern Asia, imperialism as such countries in the world which have the role to be the advanced base in the world. It happened with Israel. It could have been another plan, but this one is working well up to date. Maybe it will change, but for today, up to date, Israel is very convenient for imperialism. And that's the reason why the media will never criticize too much Israel. On the basic ground, they will criticize eventually, you are bombing Gaza, you shouldn't because children are dying. But you don't analyze the racist law in Israel, the theocratical functioning of Israel society and so on, because then you would delegitimize the idea that Israel is a democracy. And then you would delegitimize the idea that Western democracies are democracies because they are supporting an ethno-racial, theocratic or racial state.
Okay, Bruno, thank you. It was great, and now I am scared that Israel will censorship our channel.
And you are believing in the Jewish plot. You are an anti-Semite, Michał. It's bad. I'm joking. I hope they will understand it's joke.